Welcome to Reformed Theological Seminary's 18-session course entitled Preaching the Gospel in a Postmodern World. Both the older doctrinal preaching and the newer practical, user-friendly preaching often fail to preach the gospel. To preach the gospel from every passage of the Bible, we must first of all find what each passage tells us about the gospel of Christ, and secondly, what it brings to bear on the heart and life of the hearers. The late Dr. Edmund Clowney and Dr. Tim Keller will be our instructors. Dr. Clowney will show how to grasp the basic message of the Bible as it unfolds in progressive epics of Revelation. Dr. Keller will then explore ways to structure Christ-centered sermons to provide gospel-based application without moralizing, allegorizing, or psychologizing. Our course objectives will include learning how to understand and teach a text Christocentrically, apply and preach a text Christocentrically, and how to pray and deliver a text Christocentrically. The late Dr. Edmund P. Clowney was a Reformed scholar and leading churchman with decades of experience in preaching, ministry, and teaching. He served as president of Westminster Seminary from 1966 through 1984. He obtained degrees from Wheaton College, Westminster Seminary, Yale Divinity School, and had done graduate work at Union Theological Seminary. He has authored numerous books and articles. Dr. Clowney passed away on March 20th, 2005. Dr. Timothy J. Keller is the senior pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian Church in Mid-Manhattan, New York. Dr. Keller has also served as an adjunct professor at Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia. He has degrees from Bucknell University, Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and Westminster Seminary. He has authored The Reason for God, Belief in the Age of Skepticism, and Ministries of Mercy, The Call of the Jericho Road. Session 1. Introduction to the Christ-Centered Model of Preaching and an Introduction to Christ-Centered Exposition. In this session led by Tim Keller, the student receives an overview of this course, namely Christocentric Preaching and Exposition. This session gets the student to ponder the question related to the preaching of the Scriptures. How does this text tell me about Jesus? And how does the preacher show the people that to some degree their life is poorer if they don't really believe this text? In this session, we will begin to get a glimpse of how the preacher is to expound Christ, apply Christ, and adore Christ in preaching. The aim of every sermon is for the hearer to experience Christ through the text. Is Jesus made visible or only talked about? Dr. Keller gives a brief overview on the differences between Christocentric preaching versus the other types of popular styles of preaching: doctrinal, practical, or devotional preaching. Here now is Dr. Timothy Keller.
There's a prophetic aspect to a sermon, to expound and teach the text so they understand Christ. The preacher is asking this question: what does this tell me? What does this text tell me about the person, the work, and the teaching of Jesus? This is the bottom of page 4, by the way. You haven't expounded the text till you've integrated its particular message with the overall message of the Bible, the climax of God's revelation in Jesus. Now, the alternative to Christ-centered exposition is expounding biblical principles. Number 2, the kingly aspect of every sermon is to apply and counsel people with the text so they put on Christ. Now, and here's a very important question which I'll get back to this afternoon when I start to get into Christ-centered application. Right now I'm giving you the overview. The question that the preacher should be asking people is, how am I failing to rejoice in and live as if this text is true about who Jesus is and what He did? If you are preaching that Jesus Christ is, our Sabbath rest, then what your job is in the sermon is to say, how are the problems in your life to some degree reflective of the fact that you don't believe this? And that's application. And so the second thing we're trying to say is to apply and counsel people with the text so they put on Christ. The first thing is, how does this text tell me about Jesus? The second thing is, how do I show the people that to some degree their life is poor because they don't really believe this text? And show them how to do that. Turn over to page 5. The last of the aspects, expounding Christ, applying Christ, adoring Christ, is the third sub-goal, or the third perspective on the goal, remember, of each sermon, top of page 5, is to get people to adore and worship Christ with the text. See, the aim of every sermon is for them to experience Christ through the text, so the hearers have a sense of God on their hearts. We're going to get back to that too. This is to ask the question, how can I adore and rejoice in Christ from what I've learned? You haven't fulfilled the text's purpose unless you bring people into the presence of God through Christ. And the alternative is giving information. It's very difficult to tell a lot of young Reformed evangelical anyway. Maybe if you don't come from the Reformed evangelical tradition, you don't have this problem. You may find some other aspect is your problem. It's missing. But in the Reformed evangelical world, it's difficult very often to tell the difference between a sermon and a lecture. And I think there's a big difference. In a lecture, you're doing information. The goal is information transfer. In a sermon, the goal is to get people to worship on the spot. The sermon is part of worship. How terrible to say, here's the worship leader, and now here comes the sermon. No, anyway. In fact, if you really, really, really want a thumbnail, and I'll come back, turn over to the top of page 6, where you can ask these 9 questions as ways of analyzing whether or not you are hitting all the sub-goals or the perspectives on the one goal. There's the truth question. Was this a sound sermon? Was the point clear? And was Jesus preached as the climax, or was he added on or missing from the sermon? Was Jesus preached as the climax of the exposition of the text, or was he just sort of tacked on or just not even there? Second perspective, which has more to do with life-relatedness. Was it fresh? See, this is application. What difference will it make? Was it practical? And was Jesus preached as a solution to the people's problems, or were the people just told to try harder? And then thirdly, the power aspect, the adoration aspect, you see, the existential aspect. Was there a sense of God during the sermon? What was the central metaphor? Was it gripping? Something that captured the imagination? Did it get past the intellectual? And was Jesus made visible or only talked about? Now you say, what does that mean? Well, we'll get back to that, but I hope you know. Don't you sort of know intuitively? Did we just talk about Jesus, or did we really see him? You know when you've crossed the line from a lecture into a sermon? Now, I don't always get there. In fact, that's one of those things that you're really not in control of in some ways. But we'll talk more about that. Now, jump back to page 5. If you don't really look at this triperspectively, there's a danger of getting sort of trapped in one of these, either just thinking about one of the aspects alone. And if that happens, and I think, to some degree, you might want to do a little bit of analysis on your own preaching, because I know when I look back at my life, it's been very hard for me to really fully honor this model, and I have a tendency to get sort of trapped in one aspect, especially when you spend a lot of time working on one. When you realize, I got to get better at this, you work on it, and next thing you know, you've really, you've sort of missed the whole picture. There's a kind of preaching, look at number 1, which I would call doctrinal preaching. And doctrinal preaching concentrates too much on expounding, too little on other aspects. It hits the intellect rather than the heart. The result's more of a lecture. It's not life-converting. It doesn't lead the hearers to corporate worship. Now, there are a lot of approaches out there right now that I'd have to call doctrinal preaching. In the Reformed evangelical world, there's such a fear of therapy, pietism, and emotionalism that there's some people are really promoting the doctrinal approach, which is, usually they call it expository preaching. So we want expository preaching, which what they mean is getting almost trapped in the intellectual mode. I would say there's certainly people out there who are, this is the trouble with terminology, there's certainly people out there who are trying to tell you to do redemptive historical preaching or expository preaching that really are actually against the model I'm going to give you and Ed and I are going to give you, and yet I would certainly say that what we're trying to tell you about doing here this week is absolutely redemptive historical preaching and absolutely expository preaching. But you see what I'm saying? Secondly, there's a second kind of preaching that is really popular, that I'll just call it practical preaching, and it puts almost all the emphasis on application. It hits the will rather than the heart or the intellect. It is huge in the church growth movement. It doesn't challenge the mind that much. It doesn't lead the hearers to incorporate worship, to corporate worship on the spot. Let me give you several kinds. In the church growth movement, there's been an emphasis on user-friendly motivational sermons, which has to do with how to set priorities, how to handle stress, how to raise your families right, how to spend quality time with your kids. All the emphasis is on how-tos. Very little exposition of the text, very little theology, very little passion, very little sense of moving people to worship. It's How to. In the mainline church, there's sort of liberal activist preaching that you have heard for years, and it's a version of this where you do a sort of cultural commentary, analysis of current events, and then you exhort to social justice. In a lot of fundamentalist churches, the sermons are a little more than moral exhortations to live the right way. Those are all models of preaching that really, I think, they're not Christ-centered. They're missing it. There's a devotional approach to preaching, and especially in the last few years, there's been this enormous emphasis on narrative preaching. And what an awful lot of people call narrative preaching is you tell stories that get to the heart. So there's an approach that goes right for the emotions. And it's not very theological, and it's not very practical, and it's certainly not worried about, it's really not after worship, though I think they think it is. Do you see what I'm saying? A devotional approach that goes right for the emotions. Rather, and I'm done with this part, rather in the middle, sort of up at the top, no, not the top, like the third paragraph on page 5. A Christocentric model means Christ is the focus, not of one, but He's the key to all three factors. Christ-centeredness suffuses this entire model. Listen carefully. It's only as you show how the text reveals Christ that you're really giving people so that's what it means. And it's only as you solve problems with Christ that you really change lives. And I'll tell you the difference. It's when you show people that this text is really about Christ that you really move from lecture into worship. I don't know how many times that's happened to me. Here's David and Goliath, and here's, why we ought to not be afraid of the giants in our life. I'll use this because it's an easy illustration. And here's why you shouldn't be afraid, and here's why even, you should do this, and even when you start talking about all the parts that you do in the beginning, but as soon as you say, but you know what, there's a greater David that he points to, and there's a David who came up against the real giant, the only giants that can really kill you, sin and death, and he didn't go out there just at the risk of his life, but at the cost of his life, and his victory, you see, was imputed to us. The real victory, just as David's victory was imputed to his people. And as soon as you say, this is really about Christ, there's a hush and everybody gets quiet, and you've moved from a lecture into worship. As soon as you get to Christ. Christ-centeredness, it suffuses the model and keeps you from doing either doctrinal preaching only, practical preaching only, or devotional preaching only. So the goal of each sermon is to lift up Christ. The best way to make sure you get there is to think about it in these three aspects. And what the way the rest of the course works is this. Ed is going to essentially talk to you about expounding Christ. He's going to say, how do you expound Christ from all of Scripture? How do you understand the whole of the Bible as being about Christ? How do you expound Christ from the law, from the prophets, from the poets, and so on? And that's going to be his main theme. I am going to talk somewhat about that, but I'm going to give more of my time to how do you apply Christ and how do you adore. So I'm going to be doing more applying Christ and adoring Christ, and Ed's going to be doing more expounding Christ. Okay? Now, having said that, I've got, before we take questions, let me give you a little bit of an overview. Turn over to chapter 2. And in chapter 2, go to page 9. Two other things. I know for some of you, some of this is sort of old hat, but we're putting legs on it. You heard it in principle. For some of you, it's a whole new idea. I'm trying to be sensitive to that. I'm constantly speaking to large groups of people in New York City that are both Christians and non-Christians at once. It's quite a challenge. And I'm trying to be sensitive to the fact that some of you, this is a whole new idea, and some of you, this is fairly old hat. Let me keep saying things that I think will be clarifying. Let's go back to the David and Goliath story. All right. Now, there's a couple of ways of you can do it the Chuck Swindoll way. I've got a book by Chuck Swindoll called Killing Giants, Pulling Thorns, and he expounds David and Goliath. And the way he expounds David and Goliath is he talks about the faith it takes to face down the giants in your life, and that you can do it. And that's how the sermon ends. Now, there's another way to look at it, and I started giving it to you. You can also say, but David, in a sense, points to his greater ancestor. His greater descendant, a greater David. And it's interesting, you see, that what David does is he's put forth as the representative. He's, in a sense, the federal head of his people. If he loses the battle, they lose the battle. If he wins the battle, he wins the battle. In other words, they're lost in him. He's their federal head. He goes out there at the risk of his life, wins the battle, and as a result, his victory is imputed to his people. The other people didn't go out there. They didn't make the risk. They didn't walk out there into the arena with the giant. He did, and they get credit for it. If you start to preach a Christocentrically, you're starting to say now, look, why is it that you can't get out there and deal with the big giants in your life? Why are a lot of you having trouble with the problems that you're having in your career? Why are you having problems with the giants of loneliness and the giants of addiction? Why are you having the problem? Because you don't see that the real David, the greater David, has actually taken out the only giants that can really kill you. And until you see that he has beaten the real giants, which is sin and death and guilt, you're not going to be able to deal with the small giants in your life. In fact, the reason that you're not dealing with the small giants in your life is because you're not living as if Jesus Christ has really done those things for you. And I'm going to show you in this sermon. Now, one approach is sort of a typical approach where you're just expounding the text, and David becomes the example, and everybody at the end is told, now, be like David. The Christocentric approach basically says, David is pointing to Jesus, and he's pointing to an aspect of Jesus' work that right now you are not taking seriously in your life, and that's the reason why you're living in defeat. The first approach basically says this text is about you. You need to live like David. The Christocentric approach is saying this text is really about him, about what he has accomplished. And your problem is, though, you're not living as if that's true. You're not living in faith of what he's done. And therefore, the reason I believe in Christocentric preaching is not because it's a great little trick. It's a great way of doing narrative preaching. It's a cool thing to show people that everything's really about Jesus. It's a way of saying, I have the secret formula to understand every text. But unless you do Christocentric preaching, what you're really telling people is the Bible's about them. The Bible's about how... Look at what I put down here at the bottom of page 9. The ultimate reason we expound Christ in every passage is because it's the truth. The whole Bible is about Christ, but there's a very practical reason we expound Christ as well. Ed Clowney, in his book Unfolding Mystery, points out if you ever tell a particular Bible story without putting it into the Bible story about Christ, you actually change the meaning of the particular event for us. It becomes a moralistic exhortation to try harder rather than a call to live by faith in the work of Jesus. There is, in the end, only two ways to read the Bible. Is it basically about me, or is it basically about Jesus? In other words, is it basically about what I must do, or basically about what he has done? If I read David and Goliath as basically giving me an example, then the story is really about me. I must summons up the faith and courage to fight the giants in my life. But if I read it, David and Goliath is basically showing me salvation through Jesus, and the story is about him. Until I see that Jesus fought the real giants of sin, law, and death, for me, I will never have the courage, to be able to face the ordinary giants in my life, suffering, disappointment, failure, criticism, and hardship. Now, later in the week, I'm going to show you exactly how you do that in the sermon. I know some of you say, well, how do you do that? Well, but I'm trying to make the basic point. If you are only expounding a text without getting to Christ, you are doing terrible damage to the people. It's not just be theologically correct like us redemptive historical theologians. Show people how cute it is to show that this is really about Jesus. Everybody say, wow, that was really wonderful. I'm talking about something more profound. Unless you're expounding every text is about Jesus, you're changing the meaning of the Bible for the people. Is the text really about you, or is it really about him? And that's the main thing. Now, I'm going to ask Ed Clowney, by the way, is he hooked up? Is he wired yet? I'm going to ask Ed to come up and sit. This is where we both sit up here. And I'm going to let him, add what he wants. It's hard to get started. That's why I take this job. To kind of give you an overview. For some of you, it went too fast. For some of you, you said, I know all this. Let's get on with it. Well, you got to start someplace. But if Ed has anything he wants to say to add or supplement, he can, and then you can ask us questions for the next 30 minutes, 35 minutes. And it's a good time for you to start throwing out the questions that you want to make sure subjects we get to.
I just wanted to make a couple of comments to this wonderful presentation that you just heard from Tim. and he certainly has driven home the main point that he's concerned to make, and the three perspectives help immensely. I don't quite like the way he nailed me up in the doctrinal aspect and all that. And if you don't find any devotion in it, I've failed completely. Nor would I be here. So, and of course, what he said was each one well understood includes all the rest,
right.
And that's very good, I think. One comment I did want to make. You know, sometimes we think about the Bible so much as a written text that we forget it's the Word of the living God. And it's not a question of just reading and understanding a text. It's a question of hearing what God says to you. And therefore, I think we do have to remember that. It's not just understanding, as it were, but it's hearing. And hearing involves all these perspectives. Because you're hearing the living voice of the living God in preaching. It's God Himself who is speaking. It's Christ who is speaking. And therefore, we preach as those who are mouthpieces for Him.